In a modern world with significant advancements in science and technology, the expected utopia of humankind is to live in peace and harmony. However, the reality of today is far from that dream. Every day, someone's livelihood is being threatened, and their home becomes a place of danger. The world is unaware or indifferent about these people. Who are they? They are refugees and asylum seekers. A refugee is someone who is forced to flee his or her country because of persecution, war, or violence. The generally accepted definition of a refugee is stipulated within Article 1 of the 1951 Convention relating to the status of refugees, as amended by its 1967 Protocol. According to the 1951 Convention, a refugee is someone who, owing to a well-founded fear of persecution for reasons of race, religion, nationality, membership in a particular social group, or political opinion, is outside of their country of nationality or country of habitual residence, and is either unable or unwilling to avail themselves to the protection of that country due to such fear. War, as well as ethnic, tribal, and religious violence, are leading causes today of refugees fleeing their countries. On the other hand, asylum seekers are people who have yet to be recognized as a refugee, enabling them to receive legal protection and material assistance. In applying, an asylum seeker must demonstrate that his or her fear of persecution is well-founded. One of the most important international instruments in relation to refugee law is the 1951 Refugee Convention. The convention clearly spells out who a refugee is, the kind of legal protection, other assistance, and social rights he or she should receive from the countries who are signatories. The convention also defines obligations to host government and certain categories of people such as war criminals who do not qualify for refugee status. The convention was limited to protecting mainly European refugees in the aftermath of World War II. But another document, the 1967 Protocol, expanded the scope of the convention as the problem of displacement spreads across the world.
There are several problems faced by the refugee community, and this list is non-exhaustive. The first is lack of employment. Refugees are not treated the same like other people in the country. Due to the stigma and discrimination, a huge number of employers are reluctant to offer jobs to the refugees. This leads to another problem, which is poverty. Since they are unemployed, they are unable to earn money for their survival. Poverty hits them hard, and this results in other problems such as low access to healthcare. Because of poverty, the refugees are not able to buy good clothes, nutritious food, and a clean, affordable home for their families. Unhealthy and unhygienic environment cause sickness and other health problems to refugees. Other than that, vulnerable refugees often face problems like violation, exploitation, and abuse. Finally, lack of legal protection. As refugees are not legally recognized in Malaysia, they have no fundamental rights, are open to unlawful arrest, and face discrimination every day.
And as such, the implication must be addressed comprehensively.
The root of all problem lies in the fact that refugees in Malaysia have no legal status. Firstly, Malaysia is not a party to any of the existing international conventions for the protection of refugees, including CAT, ICERT 1965, and ICCPR. In particular, Malaysia is not party to the 1951 Convention, and therefore does not formally recognize any refugee status. Secondly, stemming from non-accession to the 1951 Convention, Malaysia deems itself not bound to the principle of non-refoulement, even though it is by nature a custom. The authorities largely do not subscribe to the view that non-refoulement is international customary law. NGOs and international observers have commented on instances where refugees were deported back to frontiers where clear risks of persecution exists in contravention of non-refoulement. This creates disparities and inconsistencies towards refugee treatment, which are left to the next legal issue is that Malaysian laws makes no distinction between undocumented immigrants and refugees. The Malaysian Immigration Act 1959/63 provides the powers to arrest, detain, and eventually deport undocumented persons in Malaysia. This leaves refugees vulnerable to the same penal sanctions that undocumented migrants are subjected to, including detention, corporal punishment upon conviction, and eventual deportation. Persons arrested can be detained for such indeterminate periods as deemed necessary by the authorities. Furthermore, the lack of documentation disables refugees to obtain work permits. Work is scarce for refugees as most employers are reluctant to employ them. When they are able to obtain work, it is normally on an ad hoc basis, leaving refugees vulnerable to exploitation from unscrupulous employers. Fourthly, the issue of refugee children born in Malaysia. This correlates to statelessness, in which Malaysia does not ratify the 1961 Convention on the Reduction of Statelessness and the 1954 Convention relating to the status of stateless persons. Due to their parent status, such children are hampered from obtaining birth certificates, thereby passing statelessness from one generation to another. There have been numerous cases of refugees living in Malaysia for more than 20 years without ever obtaining legal status, particularly Rohingyas from Myanmar and the Moros from the Philippines. Having lived in Malaysia for so long, these children are Malaysian-born, speak Bahasa Malaysia, and have no other home than Malaysia. They are in all respects Malaysian except legally speaking. Last but not least, no sanctions are in place to prevent the ill treatment of refugees. Refugees are left vulnerable to all sorts of ill treatment, including reports of assault, sexual abuse, and lack of access to basic needs including medical treatment and education.
There are three theories which are most applicable to our current topic. The first theory is law and justice. The theory of justice requires the law to promote human rights. Even more than that, it demands help for the poor and the marginalized. In this respect, is Malaysia's unwillingness to ratify the CISR regarded as an act of closing one eye on thy neighbor? And does a person need legal recognition before his life could be safe? Albeit allowing UNHCR to register refugee status, the UNHCR's identity cards hold no real power and authority, as operations are merely on a courtesy basis with no written authorization from the government. Now, the question which arises is whether refugees should be treated akin to illegal immigrants. As we can see, the UNHCR defines refugees as a totally different class of persons from migrants. In justifying passiveness through laws, are Malaysian laws being unjust? This is a matter which we should look into more seriously.
And so difficult to resolve, we should not forget that UNHCR has a double-headed mandate.
The second theory is access to justice. As the law itself seeks to prosecute the refugees, legal aid becomes a necessity. In the case of Iskandar against public prosecutor, a 17-year-old boy was charged for illegal presence despite being a mandated refugee under UNHCR. The charge was finally dropped when representatives of UNHCR proved his status to the court's satisfaction. Similarly, a 16-year-old Rohingya boy suffered the same fate in the 2018 case of Jiramat bin Muhammad Rashid against public prosecutor, where the court finally granted bail of 2,000 ringgit after denying it twice. By then, Jiramat had already been detained in the Kajang prison for 3 months despite being a minor. For refugees like Iskandar Jiramat, their only hope lies in the limited assistance of UNHCR, whose only presence is mainly in Kuala Lumpur.
Those displaced themselves.
The third theory is law as means of social control. The government's refusal to acknowledge refugees is due to concerns that an influx of refugees may contradict national interests. and this is controlled by the implementation of deterring laws. Therefore, penal sanctions are used against refugees, notwithstanding the fact that they are committing a victimless crime, which is an offense against the state rather than society at large. Social control should not only benefit monetary interests or avoidance of nuisance, but should also seek to impart into society the values of humanity.
To overcome this, there are several potential solutions. The first is voluntary repatriation. It is an option available to refugees who have decided to move home. The UNHCR works to make their option of safe return easier in collaboration with their home country and the international community. Currently, there is no large-scale voluntary repatriation taking place in Malaysia. With the major political developments taking place in Myanmar, the office is constantly looking at the possibility of Rohingyas to return home with dignity and peacefully. The second solution is local integration, which is a long and winding procedure that has legal, fiscal, social, and cultural ramifications. It places significant demands on the individual as well as the receiving community. The third solution is resettlement. It is a method of transferring the refugees from an asylum country to another state, which has agreed to admit them and ultimately grant them permanent settlement. UNHCR believes that this method is the only durable solution to move the refugees from an asylum country to a third country.
Saya turut menekankan kepentingan pelaksanaan strategi ini secara kolaboratif bersama pihak UNHCR.
Fourthly, active participation of the Malaysian government is needed, particularly the National Registration Department and the Ministry of Home Affairs, by implementing sufficient policies to meet refugee needs. Rather than using the Immigration Act and other statutory instruments to punish refugees, refugees should be differentiated from illegal migrants and be granted legal significance to their UNHCR cards. Besides that, exercise of the doctrine of non-refoulement should be committed, as recent events of expulsion involving Rohingyas in Langkawi Island is unjust. Furthermore, the government should reconsider ratifying the conventions relating to refugee rights in light of the increasing number of refugees hailing from the Philippines and Indonesia. These conventions provide a very comprehensive legal framework for regulating refugees that can be adjusted into Malaysian laws, thereby reinstating Malaysia's commitment to curb the issues of refugees as a UN member. The next possible solution is a procedure called the Alternatives to Detention, or ATD. ATD allows asylum seekers, refugees, and immigrants to remain in the public with freedom of movement while their migration status is being determined, or while awaiting expulsion. Detention of children should be used only as a last resort and for a brief period of time according to international law. ATD could possibly help resolve issues of refugee children being placed in detention. Not least, refugees should be formally employed in light of our high import of foreign workers, since only those enrolled with the UNHCR will be eligible to secure work permit. This would serve as an opportunity for the unregistered and undocumented migrants to officially register. Registration would enable the government to keep track of the refugees' activities and ultimately strengthen national security as well as increase economic benefits.
Obviously, it's not justified in any way. It's a human rights violation. Probably one of the reasons why they don't sign is because they know they are violating their rights. And if they sign, they have to ensure that they take steps to actively go and curb all these issues. If we want change, it's not about changing only one law. And then I guess they also think about, do Malaysians want that? Do you want people who are not Malaysians to have Malaysian rights?
I guess they can stay if they have that card from UN that recognizes them as refugees. But the long-term solution is to find a safe third place where they can go to. So even if they are recognized under the UN and Malaysia sees them with that card, if they have a third safe country, they will have to move. what is damn important is three things: education, employment, and healthcare. So when I was looking at the convention, Article 13 says that the contracting state shall accord to refugees lawfully staying in their territory the most favorable treatment as regards to the right to engage in wage-earning employment. But then when I look at this, I'm like, number one, we're not a contracting state. Okay, so this whole article doesn't apply. Number two, in this article itself, it says that refugees lawfully staying in their territory. So if you don't recognize, right, them, they're not lawfully staying in your territory, and this article doesn't apply.
The primary difficulty is the lack of legal identification. In many situations, the refugee card itself isn't sufficient to facilitate, for example, entry into a public school. Because of negotiations between UNHCR and the public healthcare system, refugees are permitted to access health facilities in public hospitals at a premium rate. So they pay much more than what locals pay. There is no provision in the Education Act for authorizing, for example, refugees to enroll in local schools. And so education has to be entirely dependent on the generosity of the public and international donors or local donors who support private schools for refugees. It is the fact that their non-recognition cuts across all areas of their lives, because all the legislation authorizing public services is typically designed exclusively for Malaysian citizens. There is a scarcity mentality among many of the people in lower socioeconomic stratas. Jobs are hard to come by, salaries are so low. People are pretty much scrambling to eke out a living. And so tensions are high, and there's a sense of, well, why should our government care about some strangers when we are the Malaysians here and we can't make a living? So I think a lot of that has to do with poor public policy in relation to poverty alleviation here as well. And secondly, I also think that a lot of that kind of attitude has to do with very poor communications about what it is we're doing as far as our humanitarian program is concerned. You rarely see the government making any kind of comments about what exactly its humanitarian program is. If you try to look up material about Malaysia's humanitarian program, you will see that it will say that since the 1970s, Malaysia has been hosting refugees with the assistance of the UNHCR, but Malaysia is not funding it. All they have done is allowed the UNHCR to have an office here and carry out its work independently. They don't fund it. So it's just about the territorial space they allow for refugees to be here. I think a very dangerous cycle that is emerging is there are entire generations of young people within our current society who never had any education, who are unable to get work, and who are being forced into crime. And so all we're doing as a result of this inadequate policy is enlarging the criminal population in our country.
To conclude, in light of the hardships suffered by refugees, the government should adopt a humanitarian approach in dealing with displaced persons and refugees. Ideally, Malaysia should not shy away from ratifying these conventions. Nevertheless, even as a non-signatory, Malaysia, in allowing refugee entry, should at most provide adequate policies to upkeep refugees' very basic needs. Neither does it hurt to give full cooperation to NGOs by officially recognizing UNHCR cards. The Malaysian community at the grassroots level should also gain awareness on this issue and undo the stigma attached to our refugees. Our survey conducted on 154 respondents showed that despite a majority empathizing with refugees, A group of people were more concerned for national resources and some were apprehensive and negative towards refugees. This may reflect the passive policy of Malaysian government and the indifference of society. Albert Einstein once said, "The world will not be destroyed by those who do evil, but by those who watch them without doing anything. Together, we can end discrimination and provide much needed assistance to the refugee that desperately needs our help."
Oh, we're going out in style, babe, and everything's on sale. We creep up on extinction. I pull your arms right in. I weep and say goodnight, love, while my organs pack it in. And here it is, our final night alive. And as the earth burns to the ground, oh God, it's you that I lie with. As the atom bomb locks in, oh, it's you I watch TV with. As the world cares, oh, it's you that I lie with. As the atom bomb locks in, yes, it's you I welcome death with. As the world caves in. As the world caves in.